Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're opening a set of sources that are, well, they're fascinating, but also pretty sobering.
They really are.
We're looking at one of the most fundamental conflicts in modern history, really. It's about what happens when a political system, one that's built on a purely materialist dogma, tries to, I don't know, replace the human soul.
That's a good way to put it. It is a study in extremes.
Yeah.
And our mission here is to look beyond just, the usual story of persecuting established churches. We want to really dig into how communist and socialist regimes waged a systematic total war.
A total war on what, specifically?
On everything. Not just organized religion, but every single spiritual, esoteric, or even occult tradition.
Anything that wasn't state-sanctioned?
Anything. Anything that suggested there was a source of meaning or allegiance or guidance that was outside the direct, centralized control of the state.
So the goal for us today is clarity. We want to sort of narrate that systematic effort, that push for complete ideological conformity. We're going to trace the specific and often brutal mechanisms they used and try to quantify the sheer, just incredible loss of religious freedom, the silencing of ancient wisdom, the dismantling of whole spiritual communities, all because these systems insisted they were the one and only source of truth.
And to really get that, to understand the operational reality of this ideological war, you have to start where they did.
Which is where?
With the philosophical case against faith itself.
Yeah.
We aren't just talking about politics here. This is about metaphysics, specifically the Marxist foundation that drove every single policy that came after.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What was the fundamental claim that Marxists were making that made eradicating spirituality not just an option but a necessity?
It all begins with the primacy of materialism. The entire Marxist foundation, it posits, as this unchallengeable truth that matter is the primary reality.
The physical world.
The physical world, economic structures, the tangible things you can touch and measure, that's the only truth that exists. So if matter is the foundational truth, then just by logical necessity, the possibility of gods or the supernatural or any kind of otherworldly causation is, well, it's completely excluded.
So it's not just that the spiritual is seen as false, it's that it's philosophically impossible within their system. It's rejected from the get-go.
Precisely. It's an a priori rejection. You can think of it like a zero-sum game. If material conditions and so-called scientific historical forces are what explain the world, then religion can only exist for two reasons.
Okay, what are they?
One, to offer false, non-scientific explanations for things, and two, critically, to function as a way to mask human exploitation.
Religion becomes a tool then, an anesthetic.
It is entirely dismissed as a tool of subjugation. You know the famous line.
The opiate of the masses.
The opiate of the masses. And the sources trace this idea way back, even to how the Greeks thought about concepts like necessity, ananke, and chance, taiche. They personified them as these great powers that dominated human life.
Right.
The Marxist argument is pretty simple. Once those powers, poverty, oppression, economic insecurity, once they no longer dominate humanity, once humanity achieves total control over its material existence,
Then the gods will just fade away.
they'll no longer be necessary.
Okay.
Because the root cause of belief, which they see as human powerlessness, has been cured by the state.
So the state, which is claiming the authority of absolute science, steps in to cure this perceived human inadequacy, and in doing so, it makes the gods redundant. But this is where the great irony comes in, right? What we're calling the dogmatic flaw.
It really is.
Yeah.
Marxism, which claims to be the voice of absolute science, the one true decoder of the science of history, it very quickly became the ideology of closed-minded rulers, its insistence on its own exclusive correctness.
That it had the one and only answer.
The absolute answer to all historical and social questions. That made any genuine dialogue, whether it was intellectual or political, completely impossible.
It sounds less like science and a lot more like a new, very rigid theology.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
It's philosophical absolutism. And absolutism is just the refusal to recognize any alternatives. If your system claims to have the final, complete truth about all of human history, you cannot possibly allow competing metaphysical explanations.
It doesn't matter where they come from.
Doesn't matter if it's from a priest, a shaman, or even another scientist whose findings happen to contradict the party line.
And we saw how this philosophical rigidity led to catastrophic political rigidity. I mean, the insistence that the party's view on, say, biology or linguistics was scientific fact, even when it was just completely contradicted by reality.
Exactly. I mean, you just have to think of the era of Lysenkoism in Soviet genetics.
Right.
The prevailing scientific view of heredity, genetics, it contradicted these foundational Marxist-Leninist principles about environmental determinism. So the official, quote-unquote, scientific view became one based purely on party ideology.
And the results were disastrous.
Horrific. It led to the persecution of brilliant geneticists, failed harvests, and tremendous widespread suffering. Discovery is impossible when it's subordinated to dogma. The system just closes itself off to any correction and becomes, inherently self-destructive.
So if a philosophy claims absolute knowledge and refuses to acknowledge any other position, spiritual or intellectual, it makes itself profoundly susceptible to becoming a tool for totalitarian tyranny.
That's a perfect summation. That's exactly it. And that is why the suppression of any non-state belief, whether it was the Russian Orthodox Church, a secret Masonic lodge, a small gathering of Baptists, or a practitioner of Central Asian shamanism, it wasn't an optional policy.
It's mandatory.
It was mandatory for the survival of the ideology, because any alternative source of meaning, any other allegiance, was seen as an existential threat.
That sets the stage perfectly for how they moved from this abstract philosophy to immediate and terrifying action, starting with the Soviet Union, which basically wrote the blueprint for these mechanisms of erasure. So when the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, this attack on spiritual life was immediate, it was widespread, and it was ferocious, wasn't it?
Absolutely. This was not some passive separation of church and state. This was what Lenin himself demanded. Propaganda that used militancy and irreconcilability towards all forms of idealism and religion.
Militancy, that's a strong word.
It was central party policy. They even created organizations like the League of Militant Atheists to carry it out. Their stated objective was nothing less than the complete annihilation of all religious institutions and ideas.
And how did they frame it?
Officially, they denounced all religious beliefs as superstitious, reactionary, and backward. And that initial phase, what we're calling phase one, it was characterized by just wholesale physical brutality and destruction.
Okay, so who was the primary target and what was the sheer scale of that initial attack?
The main target, mostly because of its size and its cultural importance, was the Russian Orthodox Church. The sources detail a campaign that is just staggering.
In what way?
Nearly all of the clergy and countless active believers were either summarily executed or sent to the new labor camps, the Gulag system.
And the charges?
Often just political unorthodoxy. Meanwhile, theological schools were shut down, religious publications were banned. The statistics are just horrifying. Before the revolution, there were over 50,000 active churches.
50,000?
By 1939, after 2 decades of this militant campaign, only about 500 remained open.
50,000 down to 500. That single statistic, it's a measure of cultural devastation. It just shows a systematic, state-mandated dismantling of an entire cultural and spiritual landscape.
And this campaign was truly comprehensive. It wasn't just limited to the Orthodox majority. Attacks on Judaism were endemic, making organized communal practice virtually impossible.
And what about other groups?
Protestant denominations, which were often seen as having these undesirable links to the West, to capitalism groups like the Baptists, Pentecostals, Adventists, they were subjected to horrific state tactics.
Like what?
Members were forcibly sent to mental hospitals, imprisoned, or even had their parental rights taken away, often for something as simple as refusing military service because of their religious beliefs.
And what about the more traditional or esoteric practices? They certainly weren't spared, were they?
Oh, not at all. They were crushed under the exact same ideological mandate. Spiritual healers, local shamans in Siberia or Central Asia, any groups that dealt in occult or esoteric philosophy, they were all branded as backward, superstitious charlatans.
Or worse.
Or worse, counter-revolutionaries. Their practices were actively suppressed, and their practitioners were rounded up and persecuted just like the clergy. The state's logic was absolute. If truth exists, it must be the truth of the state. There was zero room for private, non-materialist sources of knowledge.
The Soviet regime also had these complex regional issues to deal with, right? Particularly with Islam in Central Asia.
Yes. Initially, their big fear was a pan-Islamic movement, a transnational challenge to Soviet power. So they systematically suppressed Islam by force right up into the early 1940s.
And then the policy shifted.
And shifted from violent eradication to a kind of controlled toleration. But even then, They actively promoted atheism among Muslim populations and tried to sever the link between Islam and local ethnic identities. They did this by closing thousands of mosques and madrasas. It was a long-term game of cultural and spiritual delinking.
I want to go back to an anecdote you mentioned, one that really reveals the cold, calculating heart of this initial terror, Lenin's use of the devastating 1922 famine.
This specific incident, it gives you a chilling insight into the political utility of persecution. In March of 1922, millions were starving in Soviet Russia and Ukraine. And Lenin writes this secret letter to the Politburo.
And he frames this tragedy not as a humanitarian crisis.
No, he frames it as a perfect opportunity to launch a definitive offensive campaign against the church.
An opportunity for what, exactly?
An opportunity to act with, and this is a quote, savage and merciless energy. He demanded they carry out the confiscation of all church valuables, not stopping short of crushing any resistance. And he explicitly stated that the famine provided the perfect pretext to attack the church and kill the clergy.
Why? What was the calculation?
He believed the starving peasant masses wouldn't support the church's hold on its property when they were desperate for food. It was a cold, calculated provocation. It was designed to generate the legal and political justification for the mass murder of religious leaders.
The physical destruction, the terror, using famine as a political weapon, that was phase one. But as the Soviet Union stabilized and, needed to project a more modern image, the system changed. It transitioned into something equally sinister.
Bureaucratic strangulation.
Exactly.
And that transition is critical to understanding long-term communist control. By the 1960s, the state moved from that widespread, overt physical terror to a highly centralized, meticulous bureaucratic control. The design was to manage religion out of existence, but slowly.
And this was handled by a specific body.
Primarily by the Council on Religious Affairs, or the CRA, which operated from 1965 to 1985.
What was the relationship between the CRA and the rest of the party apparatus?
The CRA was the executive arm of religious policy. Now, technically, it was subordinate to the Council of Ministers, but in reality, it followed precise instructions from the ideological department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party.
So it was a direct tool of the party's core ideology.
And most importantly, it worked in direct daily contact with the KGB, specifically the 5th Directorate, which was tasked with fighting ideological sabotage.
So the state's main mechanism for regulating religion was, at its heart, a counterintelligence operation.
Exactly. The CRA didn't just issue permits. It was the mechanism for reducing the entire religious network and curbing the spread of all religious beliefs. The sources detail how they implemented these restrictive measures to control every single aspect of religious life.
Such as?
The registration of new communities, their organizational structure, their financial status, even the selection of their clergy. The goal was controlled decline, to make the faith just fade away through administrative asphyxiation.
But these actions sometimes backfired, didn't they? They created some unintended consequences for the state's meticulous plans.
They did, ironically. By reducing the religious network so severely, by forcing the closure or deregistration of thousands of Orthodox communities, the state drastically reduced the ability of believers to meet their religious needs in official, recognized settings.
And when the church door is locked, spiritual hunger doesn't just vanish.
No, it doesn't.
So where did that spiritual energy go?
It was forced underground. And often, it went toward the very groups the state found most problematic. Orthodox believers, unable to find spiritual fulfillment through the official channels, sometimes became, and this is a quote, the object of sectarian missionary work.
Meaning they were drawn into other groups.
They were drawn into smaller, unregistered, highly committed sectarian groups like the Baptists or the Pentecostals, which the state considered politically suspect and far more difficult to control than the compliant, registered Orthodox bodies.
So this bureaucratic repression inadvertently ended up strengthening the state's ideological opponents. It fostered the kind of resilience we see later on.
Exactly. And we also see this mixed approach in Central Asia, where the state tried to co-opt a certain version of Islam.
Right. Tell us about that.
That's the classic dual policy they had toward Islam. On the one hand, you had forced secularization, closing thousands of authentic places of worship and education. But on the other hand, they maintained this carefully curated facade of official, bureaucratized Islam, led by compliant, state-approved figures.
And that facade was entirely for external use, for an international audience.
Primarily for foreign policy, yes. specifically to court Arab and Muslim allies during the Cold War and to promote the idea that Muslims were flourishing under the Soviet banner.
Which created a huge split in people's lives.
A stark dichotomy. You had the public Soviet citizen versus the private believer. And it forced authentic religious life, the Sufi orders, the traditional scholars, family rituals. It forced all of that entirely into the underground, where the state had no visibility or control over true spiritual life.
Which brings us to the core realization they faced across the Soviet bloc. You can destroy the church building, but you can't destroy the profound, persistent human need for the sacred. It's so clear that the physical and bureaucratic destruction of institutions just wasn't enough. The regimes quickly realized that removing religion left this, what the sources describe as a dangerous void in the social fabric. Human beings just fundamentally require rituals to mark time, to celebrate life's transitions, to find some sort of shared meaning.
And recognizing this, the state attempted to substitute the sacred with the secular. They literally invented these socialist life cycle rituals to replace things like traditional baptism, marriage, and funerals.
What were these replacements actually like?
Oh, they were famously spectacularly unsuccessful. They were often sterile, deeply bureaucratic, and pretty much universally unpopular because they just lacked any genuine emotional weight or spiritual history.
Can you give us an example?
Think of the red weddings that replaced church marriages. You'd go and sign some paperwork and hear a brief, very dry speech about your duty to the collective. Or the attempt to replace baptism with something called Octobering, which was the dedication of a child to the revolution.
It sounds like pure administrative awkwardness replacing something that was once profound.
That's precisely the tone of the social mockery at the time. The sources cite contemporary satirists like Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov, who just highlighted this absurdity. They describe an Octobering ceremony where the local committee chairman was demanding immediate payment for the cheap red satin blanket they used to dedicate the newborn.
So the whole thing just felt like a clumsy transaction.
Not a rite of passage, exactly. So the people were left with these soulless bureaucratic ceremonies, with one notable exception. The state actually did succeed in appropriating and secularizing one major holiday.
And that was a new year.
Yes, Novi God, or New Year, is the prime example of a successful substitution. The regime initially banned Christmas and the Christmas tree. The Yoka in the 1920s called them bourgeois and religious relics.
But then they reversed course.
In 1935, they shrewdly reversed course. They rehabilitated the tree in the figure of Dead Moroz, or Grandfather Frost.
But they stripped them of all Christian context?
Completely. Dead Moroz was explicitly reframed. He went from being this potentially Christian or even pagan figure to the secular symbol of the new year, who brought gifts on December 31st. It was a masterful piece of cultural engineering.
And it effectively replaced Christmas in the public mind.
It did. It became the single most important family celebration in the Soviet calendar. The state learned that it could appropriate the form of tradition while completely neutralizing its religious meaning.
But perhaps the most profound substitution, and the one that really cemented the nature of these totalitarian systems, was the elevation of the revolutionary leader to the status of a god. The cult of personality.
And the irony here is just painful. Marxism was explicitly intended as an alternative to histories based on the actions of great men. It was supposed to be all about class struggle and historical forces.
But it immediately became attached to Marx himself.
As a great man, a prophet who authored scripture that contained revealed truth.
So St. Mark's replacing St. Mark as the source of the gospel.
Exactly. And this combination, the claim of absolute scientific knowledge combined with the authoritarianism of its interpreters, it created an inherent vacuum. Suppressing religion created the need, and the heroic elevation of a revolutionary leader filled that need. He provided an oracle who could pronounce on new situations that Marx had said nothing about.
In the Soviet Union, this led to the massive personality cults linking Marx and Lenin, or for a time, Stalin. Their huge, intimidating heads became the visual symbol of the relentless unfolding of history. And this wasn't unique to Moscow, was it?
Not at all. It's a recurring totalitarian pattern. In China, Mao Zedong joined the pantheon, reflecting this careful adherence to political tradition. In Vietnam, Marx was linked to Ho Chi Minh.
Right.
Even in Yugoslavia, years after his death, the national identity was summarized by the phrase: 6 republics, 5 languages, 4 religions, 3 mountain ranges, 2 alphabets, and 1 Tito. The leader becomes the living, breathing, unassailable oracle of the nation.
And if we look for the ultimate, most comprehensive extreme of this kind of political religion, we find it in North Korea, we find it in Juche.
Juche takes the personality cult and weaponizes it into a fully formed state religion. The ideology posits that a great leader is essential for the masses, not just to succeed, but fundamentally to survive.
So Kim Il-sung is cemented as the supreme deity for the people.
Yes, and you mentioned it incorporates the language of religion and family, this concept of familism.
Tell us more about that.
Xu built on familism. It draws very heavily on East Asian concepts of filial piety, loyalty, and dependency.
Yeah.
The Kim family is set up as the ultimate father figure for the entire nation. And this isn't just about political obedience.
It's about existential survival.
It is. The masses are perpetually indebted to the leader for their very existence, their health, their prosperity. Any challenge to the leader is viewed not just as treason, but as cosmic patricide.
So even though North Korea is officially an atheist state, Juche functions entirely as a deeply religious system. It's a totalitarian cult that bypasses traditional religion but completely occupies that spiritual space, demanding ultimate, unquestioning allegiance above all else.
It creates a perfectly closed ideological loop. The battle for conformity was fought on the philosophical front with materialism, on the social front with manufactured rituals, and on the spiritual front with a deification of the leader. But in Southeast Asia, this war on belief reached new heights of both violence and bureaucratic sophistication.
If the Soviet model was characterized by this calculated terror that was then followed by administrative control, the experience in Southeast Asia shows that the state's war on belief could be absolute, immediate, and genocidal, especially in Cambodia.
The Khmer Rouge regime in democratic Kampuchea, which ruled from 1975 to 1979, was an extreme realization of ultra-Maoism. This regime, which was heavily supported by the Chinese Communist Party, wanted to create a radical agrarian socialist republic.
The year zero concept?
Exactly. They were trying to achieve year zero, erasing all past structures, beliefs, and identities. And this resulted in the deaths of up to 2 million people.
And this genocide explicitly targeted spiritual life as a core part of that erasure.
Systematically and brutally. The violence against spiritual life was intrinsically linked to their crimes against humanity. They pursued the systematic elimination of the Buddhist leadership. Monks were forced to disrobe, they were tortured, or they were executed.
And the institution.
The religion was banned entirely. Pagodas, which were the centers of Cambodian community life, were destroyed. They were often repurposed as storage sheds or stables or prisons.
When you're trying to erase the past and create a completely blank slate, the spiritual guides and institutions are always the first targets, aren't they?
Always. Because they hold the collective memory and the moral authority that exists outside of state power. The sheer speed and totality of the Khmer Rouge's destruction of spiritual identity is just stunning. It was a complete 4-year campaign of hyper-violent eradication.
Now, in contrast to that, Vietnam, while less sudden in its violence, presents this long-term, chilling example of how bureaucracy can be just as effective as immediate brutality in crushing spiritual life over decades.
Vietnam uses what the sources call bureaucratic strangulation as a governing principle. The entire religious landscape is managed and overseen by the Government Committee for Religious Affairs, the GCRA.
So everything has to go through them.
Any significant religious activity, from registering a new church to the ordination of clergy or even just holding a conference, it all requires this arduous advance approval from the state, and that approval is often arbitrarily denied.
And this allows the state to maintain the illusion of religious freedom. They can point to the registered groups.
Exactly. While at the same time wielding an administrative chokehold on any group that poses a perceived ideological threat.
And the most potent tool for enforcing this administrative control is the HOCO, the household registration system.
That's the cornerstone of Vietnamese social control. If you're a member of an unregistered religious group, and registration is often made extremely difficult or just impossible for groups the state dislikes, you can be denied household registration.
Walk us through the visceral impact of that. Why is the denial of a piece of paperwork a denial of your personhood?
Well, being denied Hokau effectively strips you of fundamental citizenship rights. Without that registration, you can't legally receive state food rations. Your children are denied access to public schooling, you can't register property, and your access to state health care is severely limited or just denied outright.
So the state can turn citizens into legal non-persons.
Simply by withholding a piece of paper. It's a form of soft power persecution that is relentless and systemic.
And this systematic bureaucratic pressure is felt most acutely by indigenous and minority faiths, who are often viewed with the deepest suspicion.
Absolutely, because of fears of regional separatism. Ethnic minority Christians, especially Montagnard and Hamon Protestants in the Central Highlands, they face relentless surveillance, arbitrary detention, and this intense pressure to recant their faith.
And they're often accused of other crimes.
They're often falsely accused of political activism or charged under national security and counterterrorism laws, even when their only crime is gathering to worship outside of state-approved structures.
We see this pattern cited specifically in the context of recent mass arrests, don't we?
We do. Following the attacks in Daklak province in June 2023, even though the perpetrators were quickly identified, the Ministry of Public Security used the event to accuse foreign-based Montagnard support groups of being terrorist organizations.
And what happened then?
The subsequent mass trial convicted over 100 people, mostly Montagnards, with very lengthy prison sentences. Critics argue, and I think rightly, that this excessive response and this designation of exile groups as terrorist organizations serves as a pretext.
A pretext for what?
For intensifying discriminatory repression against Montagnards who belong to unregistered evangelical house churches. They face this double discrimination because of both their ethnic identity and their religious practices.
And this persecution extends beyond Christianity to indigenous Vietnamese religions as well?
Indeed. We see state interference with unrecognized factions of Cao Dai and Ho Hao Buddhists, particularly down in the Mekong Delta, and the imprisonment of ethnic Khmer Buddhists for anti-government protests. The government seeks not just loyalty, but total ideological control over all forms of spiritual expression.
And the ultimate spiritual crisis caused by this persecution, it led to these extreme acts of protest that really underscore the spiritual commitment of the believers.
We have to recall the Buddhist self-immolations that occurred in unified Vietnam. In November of 1975, 12 monks and nuns burned themselves to death in Can Tho to protest the government's treatment of their faith. And in 1977, Thich Nhat Hanh immolated herself in Hanoi, explicitly saying she aimed to be a torch of wisdom to bring about religious tolerance. These acts were desperate spiritual resistance against the ban of the Unified Buddhist Church of Vietnam. It demonstrated that the state could crush the body, but it could not crush the commitment to a higher truth.
The lesson across the Soviet bloc and Southeast Asia, then, is that even the most calculated machine, whether it's bureaucratic or violent, could not entirely crush the spiritual impulse.
It's a truly profound and, in a way, hopeful realization. Despite the overwhelming brutality of the Soviet blueprint and the sophisticated bureaucratic strangulation we see elsewhere, the state's attempt to stamp out religion was an absolute and fundamental failure.
Absolutely. The state proved it could kill the body, but not the spirit. And in fact, we see empirical evidence that faith not only survived, but it became the single greatest vehicle for political and ideological resistance against totalitarianism.
And this resilience, it highlights this intrinsic, unquenchable human hunger for spiritual truth. We see this manifested physically in the underground publishing networks that flourished in the Soviet Union.
Is samizdat.
Samizdat, or manual self-publishing.
We often associate samizdat with political dissidents like Solzhenitsyn, but the sources make it really clear that this risky, clandestine activity, manually reproducing censored documents, often on old typewriters with carbon paper, was profoundly spiritual in its motivation.
It was a spiritual act of resistance. It demanded tremendous courage. I mean, can you imagine the risk of imprisonment just to type out pages of banned text?
It's incredible.
And the sheer fact that a full 20% of these underground archives consisted of religious literature that demonstrates the deep hunger for spiritual truth. People needed theological texts, philosophical guidance outside of Marxism, moral support. This network, this clandestine Gutenberg galaxy, was systematically preparing the intellectual ground for the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union by undermining the state's monopoly on truth and meaning.
It shows that access to theological and philosophical texts, not just political tracts, was a primary motivator for risking decades in the Gulag. And this leads us perfectly to the Polish phenomenon, where the Catholic Church provided the institutional infrastructure for the solidarity movement and eventually for political change.
Poland is the ultimate counterexample to the Soviet strategy. Unlike the Russian Orthodox Church, which had been decimated and largely co-opted, the Catholic Church in Poland retained its institutional independence.
And that was key.
It was critical. It had tremendous social authority and, crucially, its financial autonomy. It provided the spiritual and the physical framework for the nascent solidarity movement.
So the institutional framework was intact, and that enabled key religious figures to turn a political struggle into a spiritual battle.
Precisely. You just have to look at the sermons of Father Jerzy Popiosko in the 1980s. He framed the struggle against the communist regime not just as a political or economic argument, but as a spiritual battle.
For what?
For truth, for human dignity, and for the freedom of conscience. He spoke of opposing falsehood with truth and being free from fear. His subsequent brutal murder by the secret police in 1984 served as a potent, immediate martyrdom that just absolutely galvanized the opposition. It solidified the church's role as the moral leader of the resistance.
So the state's violence backfired spectacularly, and then there was the external global catalyst, Pope John Paul II.
The influence of the Polish Pope cannot be overstated. His 1979 pilgrimage back to his homeland was a catalyst for revolution. The sources detail how his presence completely transformed the psychological landscape of the nation.
How so?
His sermons reinforced a sense of national identity that was tied to faith. They encouraged a moral reevaluation of labor rights, and they fundamentally reinforced the people's resolve for change against the communist rulers. His visit was a public demonstration that the party was not the ultimate authority. Millions came to see him, defying the regime's attempts to minimize the spectacle.
This all speaks to what the sources term the backfire effect of persecution.
And this is a critical psychological observation. The human psychological response to repression is often counterintuitive to what the oppressor intends. Persecution often strengthens what psychologists call identity fusion.
What's that?
It's where the personal self becomes fully permeable with the group identity. When a group is attacked for what it believes, the commitment of its members deepens. The empirical evidence really supports the idea that the blood of the martyrs effect is profoundly real.
So the repression of the church in Poland and the persecution of house churches in China, it didn't eradicate them. It deepened their cohesion and resilience.
It made them far more resilient than they might have been if they had just existed in a liberal, tolerant society. The repression created this high-stakes barrier to entry. It ensured that only the truly committed remained, and those committed members found deep spiritual and social solidarity in defiance of the state.
A painful historical irony.
It is. The more absolute the totalitarian repression, the more absolute the spiritual commitment it generated.
That brings us to our final analysis. We've seen the blueprints, the purges, the confiscation, the KGB infiltration, the bureaucratic strangulation, the genocidal campaigns. So it's a necessary question to ask. Why did communism, which was theoretically built on the most advanced science, fail so spectacularly?
Fundamentally, communism failed, not just economically, though that failure was certainly profound, but it failed philosophically and morally. Its defeat came from what the sources call the blindness of its thinking and its profound disrespect for the intrinsic worth of human beings.
That goes right back to the dogmatic flaw we talked about at the start.
Exactly. The system's insistence on absolute science and its conceptual rigidity meant it could only be maintained by silencing opposition. Because the moment opposition spoke, it exposed the system's inherent flaws, its inability to feed its people, its economic failures, its suppression of truth.
So the system had to silence people.
It had to, because by its own reckoning, persons don't count compared to the dictates of historical necessity or class interest.
The individual was sacrificed for the abstract idea of the masses.
And that was the fatal, unforgivable error. By overruling the value of the individual, by submitting human life to these impersonal forces, the dictatorship of the autocrat or the infallible party, it created a moral and spiritual vacuum. And the only way to deal with that vacuum was through forced conformity, the maintenance of that closed-minded ruler model, and the systematic destruction of anything that offered a higher allegiance.
This detailed historical analysis, it provides a crucial lens for viewing contemporary authoritarian states. We need to be looking for those historical patterns of control resurfacing today, sometimes wrapped in new, seemingly benign rhetoric or framed in terms of national security.
And we're seeing these blueprints actively repurposed, especially in China under the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. Under Xi Jinping, the CCP is pushing hard to implement Sinicization.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they're forcing all religions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism, to conform entirely to party doctrine and the customs of the majority Han Chinese population.
That is the direct descendant of the Soviet model of bureaucratic strangulation and ideological conformity, just with Chinese characteristic.
It is meticulous control. New regulations require religious groups to accept and spread CCP ideology and values, with all activities requiring state approval. And this goes beyond simple oversight.
How so?
The state actively intervenes in Scripture. They suggest revisions to biblical or Buddhist texts to align them with socialist values. They mandate the removal of crosses from churches, and they ban unregistered domestic groups from sharing religious content online, specifically targeting Christianity-related content on platforms like WeChat.
And even the Vatican's provisional agreement with the Catholic Church over bishop appointments doesn't grant true autonomy, does it?
Not at all. The CCP continually tests and strains that agreement by acting unilaterally. The state retains the ultimate veto power over the very heart of the faith structure. It ensures the institutional church, if it exists at all, serves the party, not the spiritual needs of its adherents.
And these patterns of controlling belief aren't just limited to large communist states. We see these global echoes where the instinct to crush any allegiance higher than the state remains constant.
We absolutely do. I mean, consider Pakistan, where the mandatory death penalty for blasphemy creates an immediate existential threat to anyone who challenges state-sanctioned religious narratives. We see legal persecution against the Ahmadiyya community,
Right.
where the penal code explicitly discriminates against them.
Yeah.
It prohibits them from indirectly or directly posing as a Muslim, it bans them from building mosques, and it routinely jails them for blasphemy. This is legalized, bureaucratic persecution used to enforce a monolithic religious conformity.
And in Indonesia, which is often viewed as more moderate, we still see systemic discrimination against minorities.
That discrimination is fueled by laws like the blasphemy law, which only officially recognizes 6 religions. Officials often facilitate the harassment of religious minorities, and sometimes they blame the victims, like Ahmadiyya or Christians, for militant attacks or social unrest.
And they use administrative tools?
Classic bureaucratic strangulation. They refuse to issue building permits for houses of worship to pressure minority congregations to relocate or disperse.
And finally, just to bring it full circle, back to Vietnam. The bureaucratic campaign against ethnic and religious minorities continues today. It demonstrates the enduring nature of these controls.
The harassment and intimidation of Montagnard and Hmong Christians in the Central Highlands are ongoing, systematic, and severe. The government continues to use national security laws to impose lengthy prison sentences on members of ethnic minorities, constantly accusing them of having connections to overseas organizations that espouse separatist aims.
So it's the same pattern.
Whether it's the outright violence of the past or the subtle denial of a hope today, the goal remains identical: total control over the spiritual domain and the eradication of any non-state sanctioned loyalty.
What stands out after tracing this entire journey from philosophical dogma to genocidal violence and bureaucratic strangulation is that the state's instinct to control belief is constant. It manifests differently from the Soviet rifle and the Chinese rewriting of scripture to the Vietnamese bureaucratic form, but that underlying totalitarian impulse remains identical.
That is the most critical takeaway.
Yeah.
Any totalitarian or authoritarian system, whether it's political or purely ideological, must ultimately attempt to crush or absorb any belief system that demands an allegiance higher than the state itself. That profound allegiance, that ultimate source of meaning and moral authority, is what the state simply cannot tolerate if it intends to maintain absolute power.
And that's why the lessons from the Gulag, from the destroyed pagodas of Cambodia, and from the underground churches of China, that's why they matter now more than ever for every single one of you listening.
The freedom of conscience, the right to explore any spiritual path, to find meaning outside of state-approved narratives, is intrinsically tied to the overall freedom and health of a society.
Yeah.
We have to stay vigilant, not just against the overt acts of persecution, but against the subtle, bureaucratic, or rhetorical erosions of this right.
Because those are the building blocks.
Because those subtle erosions, the denying of permits, the rewriting of history, the mandated conformity, they are precisely how the most crushing systems of spiritual control are built in the modern world.
A powerful and necessary note on which to conclude this deep dive into the conflicts between ideology and the human soul. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.